SKALD Against the Black Priory is a retro-inspired Lovecraftian horror CRPG, where after being hired to find someone's daughter, your ship is sunken by a sea monster and you end up stranded on a seemingly cursed island. The game is available on PC. Atmosphere. There's a warmth to the pixel art, but also a gripping darkness to the environments. The game is full of colourful and strange characters and bizarre and harrowing events, but the retro style compounds it down to a pensive tone, like you're constantly waiting for something ominous that looms in the distance to come over the horizon. It's a feeling that sort of continues throughout the game as you explore darkened caves, dark fantasy towers, and desolated towns. The people are changed and who's left are understandably scared. But the moment-to-moment gameplay changes. The exploration is tense. Prodding through old basements and profane churches is made more interesting with the game's limited vision system, where you explore rooms bit by bit to give the top-down traversal the feeling of delving into a darkened crypt with a lantern. And whilst this makes it more tense to bump into monsters in the darkness, it really does more for the immersion. It feels more realistic. The combat can drag on depending on what your builds and equipment are, and some fights feel endless, which does wane on the atmosphere, but your opponents can also be terrifyingly powerful in a way that you can only discover once you're fighting them, thanks to the turn-based combat, with a battle of attrition being preferable over a swift death. The game has atmosphere in spades and manages to still feel vaguely ominous even over long periods of time. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game's scares are pretty few and far between, with most relating to story revelations and concepts the game reveals. It doesn't try jump scares or scripted events, and the biggest traditional shock you can get is getting pulled into a combat encounter. What it does do is work with the literary edge to make each story section feel shocking as you click the mouse to progress the screen, with the graphics being about as shocking as it really gets. It's understandably not going to work for everyone, and their investment in the story will weigh heavily on how impactful it can possibly be. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The game's music is inspired by 8-bit computers of the day, invoking the Commodore 64 and similar systems, and the music itself is constantly soaked in the dark fantasy vibe of a town teetering on the edge or an uneasy night in the woods. The music is a little limited in its variety though, and it would have really benefited from just a few more combat pieces, but the selection in the game is still very emotive. There's no voice acting in the game, and the sound effects also invoke the 8-bit era with some really classic noises for doors and magic, though there are some more modern bitrate samples mixed in there too, which still feel consistent somehow. The game's audio didn't really need to do much more than back up the visuals, and it does that excellently. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. The game's gore really only appears in combat and the game's cutscenes, with the former being mostly just a splattering sound and some red pixels to represent the brutality of combat, which it does well enough to a degree. The gore in the cutscenes, however, is really impressively done, with the pixel art doing a pretty decent job of representing as accurately as it possibly can the horrors of the bloody world left behind in the wake of something inconceivable. There's some gruesome sights in store and some haunting renditions of grim things, all lovingly drawn in the 8-bit style. That's 3 Harry Masons. Story. After you finish creating your character, you're introduced to the ship crash, and whilst in the water you recall why you came here. You swore to find an old friend's missing daughter, and now your ship has been sunken by a horrible beast and you wash ashore with nothing. The game's story is obviously its highlight, and there's lots of quests and points of interest that really fill out the game as an RPG, with plenty of things to string along behind the main story. Some are better than others in typical RPG fashion, but some really manage to be disturbingly impressive and give you something to think about after the quest is over. There's a lot of character interactions with your own party and a ton of people to talk to outside of that, alongside some truly amazingly written diary entries that are on par with the rest of the game. Needless to say, it's a very story-rich game, and even some of the shorter quests have enough effort put into them to at least be vaguely compelling. The overarching story, however, is that murky dread that lurks on the horizon as you discover more and more disturbing things, towns where the citizens went mad, the horrors that lurk in the mines, and it's very fulfilling. There's always context and explanations for things, whether you need it or not, and naturally it requires a lot of reading, but the most impressive thing is that the story manages to just be horrible in places. Things are cruel and unforgiving, and you walk away as tainted as the land itself. It's done really, really well, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. SKALD Against the Black Priory was a retro treat to play, but something that clearly requires a lot of special interest to want to play it to begin with. It's an old-fashioned CRPG with clearly a lot of attention to detail to the kind of era it wanted to project. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I got to the Black Priory, I didn't go mad and advise you don't either. There will always be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Also check out Bumps on Another Night. Peace.